And the problem, of course, is we don't have an SEC to keep IT analysts in line. But the bottom line here is, in the technology world, IT analysts are often advising both buyers and sellers at the same time. So I think it's worth, letting that sink in for a moment.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. My name's Jarrod Gingras. I'm the Managing Director here at Real Story Group.
And I'm Tony Byrne, the founder of Real Story Group.
Tony, we got a fun topic today, and to be honest, one that hits a little bit close to home. This is the topic we're going to cover is why IT industry analysts suck. And it hits close to home because we're industry analysts.
Yeah, that's right. And full disclosure, we compete with some of the big industry analysts, but we'll talk a little bit later. We made a decision to be a little bit different.
Yeah, so let's talk about kind of what we sometimes call the traditional big industry analysts in our world. Let's be honest, they're household names for many of the listeners on this podcast. The Forresters, the IDCs, the Gartner. Kind of provincially, we sometimes refer to those big traditional analyst firms as the FIG vendors. FIG, Forrester, IDC, and Gartner. But they're kind of the big behemoths in our world that have something to say about kind of everything.
Yeah, I mean, they're a fact of life in enterprise IT and certainly a fact of life in MarTech. We can make fun of their quadrants in ways, yet the reality is they're still influential. They're influential for vendors, but especially for enterprise customers.
Yeah, Tony, you mentioned influence. They certainly have influence, and this kind of begs the question on an ongoing basis for us and some of our clients, who's benefiting from this influence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to that question is exactly why I founded Real Story Group, 2 decades ago, is that I thought that there needed to be a different approach where we take a more kind of consumer reports type model where we're only advising enterprise buyers. And this turned out to be, I didn't know it then, but this turned out to be a rather unique model.
Yeah, so let's maybe, I know I've heard this story a bunch of times, Tony, about why you started, Real Story Group, but formerly CMS Watch when you first kicked this off more than 20 years ago. But let's give our listeners a little bit of a history lesson, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, there's an origin story here that I think is meaningful, which is, in the late 90s up till 2001, I was working at this design build firm, what we called back then quaintly a web agency. And I was the head of the development team, the engineers. And we used reports, we licensed reports, research from Gartner and Forrester and Yankee Group and IDC and others. And we found that our experience actually implementing the tools was radically different from what they were saying in the reports. And the vendors that they decided as leaders from an actual IT standpoint were really often laggards. And this was causing problems for us implementing some of these tools, originally CMS and search tools. So I thought, there had to be another way to create a different kind of analyst firms.
Yeah, so I know I was working as a implementer during that similar time as well, and I don't know about you, but they felt like a necessity, like something you had to check what the analysts were saying before you made any decision of your own. So I'm curious, Tony, like me, you were frustrated probably with the analyst world, but then you decided to, if you can't beat them, join them.
Yeah, at some level, but I really wanted to start a different kind of firm, which I realized later is actually a totally unique model in the analyst world. Solely what's sometimes called a buy-side analyst, meaning we only work on the enterprise customer side of the table.
Yeah, so when you say buy side, that takes me a little bit outside of the technology world for a second. I know many of us pay as much or as little attention as we can to the financial world. And there's a whole financial analyst space that exists in the financial world. And there's this really distinct division between sell-side analysts and buy-side analysts. Sell-side analysts are the ones who are advising financial institutions, promoting their products, while the buy-side analysts evaluate those offerings for prospective buyers, the customers, if you will.
That's right. And in most countries, when a financial analyst firm does both of these things, there are strict, so-called Chinese firewalls between those two. And if the buy side and the sell side analysts ever meet, they have to do it, with a lawyer present. It's serious stuff.
Yeah, firewalls, in theory or in actuality, I think they make a lot of sense, for ethical reasons, fiduciary reasons. But the question remains, what happens when those lines are crossed?
Yeah, well, in the United States, there's this entity called the Security and Exchanges Commission, or the SEC. And the whole rationale for the SEC is that if we let, these financial analysts, if we let them out unchecked, we'll say they have a long and rather sordid history of, let's just say, bending objectivity in favor of profit. So maybe I should just actually explain this with a story of this guy, Jack Grubman, who was back in the early 2000s was a famous telecom analyst, and he brazenly advised both industry CEOs, financial CEOs, major telecom customers, claiming that he was quote unquote sculpting the market, and he would essentially help vendors build financial products for telecom companies, and then help customers pick those products. And when he was challenged on this in the early 2000s, he summed it up like this. He said, objectivity, that's another word for being uninformed. Of course, the SEC then disagreed and banned him for life.
Yeah, that sculpting the industry term sounds very familiar. So taking it back to MarTech, we see kind of the big analyst firms oftentimes sculpting a market or creating marketplaces, before we even have seen anything on our radar to that respect.
That's right. It can almost be godlike. And the problem, of course, is we don't have an SEC to keep IT analysts in line. But the bottom line here is, in the technology world, IT analysts are often advising both buyers and sellers at the same time. So I think it's worth, letting that sink in for a moment.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about why this really matters for the people we most care about, the buyers of technology, right? The tech analyst world is obviously not as important as the financial world. We can both agree on that, and we'll never have the equivalent of an SEC. So why does it matter for technology customers?
Yeah, I think there's many big problems here. I'll try to just focus on the most important ones, which is, first, the so-called FIG analysts. They tend to favor large established vendors who are incidentally, very powerful customers of those analyst firms. And this is bad for a couple of reasons. First, we've always said in the MarTech world, you have a greater risk of overbuying technology than underbuying. And so this leads to a lot of misinvestment and a lot of grief among MarTech teams, who buy platforms that are too big. But secondly, and this is really a big one, is that the major analyst firms almost always end up promoting vendor solutions that are well past their sell-by dates, right? So a good example is Autonomy Interwoven in the web CMS space, or today Sitecore and Adobe, where analysts are still heavily promoting technologies that have an enormous amount of technical debt.
Yeah, and it's not just web CMS. We see it across the board. As you look across the stack, on all the different marketplaces that we do cover. Salesforce and outbound marketing. I follow the DAM marketplace very closely. You see the Adobes and Sitecore, and even those are the most recent ones that we see getting pushed. But historically there were. You can replace those names with other names like the Oracles and the OpenTechs of the world. For years, those were the ones that were, overrated, if you will.
Yeah, really overrated and well past their time. And I think there's a related issue here kind of on the other side of the spectrum, where analysts will come up with these bullshit terms to give coverage to failing vendor strategies. And remember, they're paid to do this.
Yeah, what's the prime example that comes to your mind?
Well, the prime example is in the web CMS space, where vendors came up with this phrase DXP, or Digital Experience Platform, which was really coverage for portal vendors trying to be relevant in a world where they're no longer relevant, and also for CMS vendors that were trying to acquire a bunch of other tools and then sell them as this digital experience suite. And that turned out to be an awful strategy, first and foremost for customers. It's kind of failing in the market now. But analysts kind of made this up, and vendors kind of won, but customers really lost.
It's so funny, that disconnect, Tony. I know you and I we're in the weeds here. We see analyst firms writing about DXPs for a decade, right? And I have never had a client come to us and said, "Hey, can you help me pick a DXP?" Yeah. It just doesn't happen. That's not the problem that exists.
Yeah, and by the way, a DXP actually doesn't exist. Right. There's no such thing as a DXP. It's kind of made up out of thin air. And all it did was just kind of confuse people and allow failing vendors to try to remain relevant in a market when they kind of no longer were. So, but speaking about vendors, I think there's a third problem here, which is that, vendors who don't play the analyst game, they get sidelined in this market, and that's not always a good thing.
Yeah, I've totally seen this. We're constantly recommending shortlists for our clients, right? And invariably, someone will raise their hand at mostly our biggest clients in particular. The Fortune 100 companies. They always say, "Well, thank you for your shortlist, but let's just go see what the FIG analysts are saying. Let's go see what Forrester and IDC and Gartner are saying, just to make sure." And then they invariably will sometimes come back, "Well, why didn't you include this one? They're well in the upper right of this quadrant or wave," and say, "Well, I have good reasons, and here it is."
Yeah, or why are you recommending a vendor that's not in the winning quadrant, or maybe not in the matrix at all? And we see this all the time. And usually, fortunately, we have the research to be able to push back on this, but I wonder what happens to enterprise MarTech leaders who are trying to go this alone. A great example is the CDP market, where many of the most prevalent vendors are smaller independent players, and the large analyst firms very often don't understand them. In some cases, don't cover them or don't cover them effectively. At the end of the day, this is really a lobbying game, right? They talk like it's PR, but really it's about lobbying, and it's a rigged game, and that means poor choices for MarTech leaders, and sometimes catastrophic choices if they make the wrong choice.
Yeah, and just putting myself in the shoes of our clients, I understand why you're trying to do your due diligence and trying to check all the boxes, and maybe you feel like no one got fired for choosing a platform in the upper right quadrant. But we've seen it firsthand that some MarTech careers have certainly gotten crimped and derailed because they picked a product that was fundamentally the wrong fit for what they were trying to do. It might have been looked good in a single snapshot view of the marketplace, but there's no best vendor out there, Tony. That's true across every marketplace that we cover. But there is a best one for you, and it's your job to find that best vendor. Don't just look at that single snapshot view and think that's going to meet all your needs.
Yeah. So we're kind of bashing analyst firms here, and I'll point out that. It's in the interest of transparency, since we're the Real Story Group, I'll say that we compete with some of these analyst firms at some level. So you can take that with a grain of salt. But I also wanted to point out that, there are ethical analysts out there as individuals, many, if not most, that we've gotten to know. And there's a lot of smart, principled people who work for the FIG vendors. But the problem is, Jarrod, that the system as a whole is rigged. And just before we get off this horse, I think it's worth adding that the system it's also rigged for tech vendors as well, not just customers. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, especially if you're a disruptor, and we know it's rigged because they tell us about it.
Yeah, we see it a lot. We talk about the big vendors, but it's particularly disheartening sometimes if you're kind of in the small to mid-size technology vendor. You're trying to make a name for yourself. You've got a decent, solid product. You've got some loyal customers. You're gaining traction, and naturally, you want some analyst coverage, right? So we get phone calls from these all the time. But to get the attention of those big analyst firms, you have to spend tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. And without that, good luck getting a call back.
Yeah, that's right. It's not like there's necessarily direct bribery here. I mean, vendors can't literally pay their way into the ranking. The game is more subtle than that. What they can do is pay for influence and for access and for repeated cozy briefings where they can lobby for a better score. Remember, this is a paid lobbying industry.
Right. It's definitely not direct bribery, but we see it all the time, and we get asked by vendors to do this, and we say no, but we get asked to shape their roadmaps and positioning. They say, "Oh, well, what are you hearing from your clients? What should we do next? What should we put on our roadmap for 2026? What are the things that should bubble to the top?" And we politely decline, sometimes not so politely, but other firms are getting paid by these vendors.
Yeah, and what's really then you can imagine, okay, what happens if the same analyst firm, or most often the same analyst, then has to go back and talk to an enterprise customer, to evaluate that vendor in public or in private. How often do you think an analyst firm is going to say, "Oh, my own strategy was a mistake"? I mean, who on earth is going to call their own baby ugly, right?
No one.
And this is, again, one of the many reasons why I founded RSG. This is a prohibitive conflict of interest, and it's made our life, a lot easier, honestly, if by only focusing on the customer side of the table.
Yeah. So, in the end, I kind of, this is one of the times I do kind of feel bad for the vendors that we're watching, because they feel like they have to play this game, and some have gotten really good at it, some are really frustrated with it, and but they still feel like they have to do it. And we see some of the larger MarTech vendors out there, they're paying these analyst firms year after year after year because they think that it's going to just give them the visibility they need that's going to have a return on investment. But by definition, I having watched this for multiple decades now, this kind of paid for influence just warps the marketplace, and it takes us further and further away from the needs and wants of the buyer, who is ultimately the most important here.
Yeah, totally.
So let's talk about what we can do. What can enterprise technology buyers and customers do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question to kind of wrap up on. I think if you're an enterprise MarTech leader, look, I'm not going to tell you to drop your subscription to a major analyst firm, although there is no harm in kind of reviewing your spend with the likes of the FIG analyst firms and the value that you're getting. But I think the first order of business is to truly understand the analyst firm model. This is an influencer game, and you, the customer, you're not at the table. You are on the table, man. You are on the menu, baby. And this might sound like a conspiracy theory, but it's a reality check. And as my grandmother used to say, forewarned is forearmed. So you should be forewarned.
Yeah. So over the years we've come up with a couple things that you can do, and it's not always easy, but this is something you should strive to do as a potential buyer and customer of these technologies, or of this analyst firm that might be advising you on your really important decision. First, you got to insist on transparency. Understand which vendors they've worked with, which ones have they advised in some way, shape, or form, and some way, shape, or form. But you can certainly ask the questions. But simpler than that, go see who they're doing webinars with, whose conferences are they speaking at, and you can understand pretty quickly where the relationships lie. And secondly, take any research, even ours, with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's right. And you need to take all the inputs with a grain of salt. Everyone has biases. It's a question of how transparent or what's the rationale for those biases. And of course, in an AI world, you have to even double down on that kind of diligence. But still, I would say one thing that's really important to look for is candor. And that's not often what you see in an analyst report. Like, they'll sometimes talk about challenges instead of outright weaknesses. And that's a dead giveaway that they're playing with kid gloves. So what we try to do at Real Story Group is get into real issues of critical consideration, topics like scalability, customer support, and technical debt. And this is total untouchable stuff for other analysts to get into, because they know that those topics can make or break a platform, and the vendor's really going to push back on them, even mentioning those topics very often.
Yeah, and those are like the really important functional considerations. But I'm going to come back to something I mentioned earlier, and I think it's just so critical here. Is, as a buyer, you need to be thinking about, at every step of the way, how good of a fit is this vendor for me, right? And it's not about what the static quadrant and the single snapshot views of a marketplace is showing you, because that's not saying how good of a fit is it for your needs. They're just a context-free snapshot. And in fact, we know the quadrant motif works, because people keep going back to that. It's something that makes sense to everyone.
Yeah. But I don't have a problem with quadrants. They just shouldn't be magical, right?
Exactly, right. Yeah. So they have some use, right? They tell some part of the story, but that's not the whole story. They're not magic, as you say. And actually, a few years ago, we tried to extend this motif for ourselves, and we built some custom tools that we call real quadrants. And this is all about matching your unique use cases with the core fundamental use cases that these technologies were built to solve in an ongoing basis. And we try to play matchmaker in our quadrants to show you anything in the upper right hand of our quadrants is fundamentally a fit for your use cases, your needs, as you've told them to us.
Yeah. Really, really interesting stuff. And again, you want to take with a grain of salt any quadrant that you get, but it certainly ought to be contextualized.
All right. So let's recap a little bit here. So at the end of the day, The IT analyst industry doesn't have an SEC. We'll never have an SEC. There's no watchdog with any kind of teeth, but there is you, the customer, and your budget speaks louder than any chart or quadrant or wave will ever show.
That's right. So the next time you're handed a quadrant or a wave in some sort of vendor pitch or a consulting firm gives it to you, ask where it came from and ask who paid for it. And above all, ask what it really means for your business, because independence isn't a default; it's a choice. And you always want to be forewarned that this is a rigged system, and you, the customer, you don't have to participate.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up with that. And I do want to wrap up with make a connection to our next episode. Our next episode is going to be called "What Enterprise MarTech Leaders Really Think," and this is on the heels of a very important meeting we just had with some of our biggest clients. We call our regular meetings the MarTech Stack Leadership Council. It's a group of Fortune 500 companies or representatives from Fortune 500 companies who meet quarterly, and we talk about topics across a broad spectrum. But the disconnect between analysts' advice and what they're seeing in reality is something that comes up all the time in these meetings. And next episode, we're going to dig into some more of this and some more real topical or top of mind issues that our clients are facing in mid 2025.
Yeah, I'm super looking forward to it because, people can tell by now, those of you listening out here, we have opinions. We have strong opinions. You heard some today. But what we're going to be sharing really are the opinions of the person that matters the most, which is the MarTech leader. So we're going to be summarizing some of the experiences, opinions, what are these leaders really facing, and sharing, I think, some real life insights from your peers out there. So do have a listen to our next episode.
And as always, you heard our story today, but we want to hear your story. So if you have some experiences that align or maybe are different than ours, feel free to share that with us. Go to your favorite podcast or video platform and leave a comment, telling us your story. Send us an email. We might mention it on a future episode. But subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Comment, tell us your stories about the good and bad and ugly. We want to hear it.
Thanks, Jarrod. Always fun catching up with you.
Likewise. We'll see you next time, everyone. Thank you.
Bye now.